So to start off, can you tell me where both sides of your family are originally from?
Okay, so my father's side, as far as I know, is from Harpet, and my paternal grandmother, who was from an Syrian orphanage, she, to my understanding, is from Mush, and I guess around that same area.
Mhm.
Then on my mother's side, my grandmother is from Izmit, and that's near what was Constantinople, and my uh, maternal grandfather is from Urdu,
Mhm.
which is on the Black Sea. So their stories are, as far as how they got together, really a bit complicated, but in a nutshell, for my father's side is pretty more straightforward. So my grandfather came here, I guess, during the Hamidian massacres,
Mm.
and he went back and forth a couple of times, but eventually, and it's very fuzzy, so I can't give you much detail, but he is on the ship manifest in Ellis Island, so I see his name there. Then my grandmother, that side, has a very complicated story, and we have cousins in Wisconsin who are really into family heritage, and
Mm.
they've done an extremely wonderful job in putting this whole family history together on that side because they're Antaramians as well. And so they're still digging up information about my grandmother, who has basically three origin stories, and we're
Mm.
not sure which one it is. So, and I've been trying to put it into kind of like some poetry or something because it's so complicated, but how do you synthesize something like that? So, one is she definitely was in an orphanage. That part is understood, but we're not sure where she had come from, and there's some, or how she was picked up. Some say a little girl on the side of the road. Some say, by the river and things like that. So,
Mm.
so that's the mystery. She's the mystery. But what happened? There was some kind of a switch in birth certificates with her when she finally got to the orphanage, and so or when she got out of the orphanage and she got married. So that is an important part of our story because
Mm.
that's the way we were able to get out of Soviet Union after, with her showing she was US born.
Oh
So
wow.
it was really a very strange, yeah, scenario. And then on my mother's side, so then and they ended up in Chicago area
Okay.
and Wisconsin area. So then on my mother's side, my grandfather was apparently on um, um, some working uh, trip with his father when the massacres opened up,
Mm.
began, and so my great grandmother of that side, his mother, somehow got word to them, don't come back to Armenia, because they were in Georgia or something,
Mm.
and so they traded hazelnuts, or they were, kind of like in what do they say, goods trades. And so she said, don't come back because this is what's happening. She ultimately got killed. The kids somehow separated because there was a big family. So my grandfather was stuck, and then his
Wow.
his father died. I'm not sure how, maybe just from the broken heart of what's happening. I don't know exactly. But my grandfather ended up in an orphanage, and I don't know how he got there, in Paris.
Mm.
So somehow traveled, or maybe had contacts, however it was, he ended up in Paris. My grandmother on my mother's side, she has a lot more because she actually wrote down her story.
Mm.
So I was and she was a storyteller, so
Wow.
it was good to have that when I was young, because then I have a little bit more information about her, and she loved to talk about it. So she was from a family that was both Protestant and the what the Catholicos, kind of the
Catholic?
apostolic,
Oh,
the
oh,
apostolic and Protestant.
okay.
So I think it was the father was the Protestant side, the mother was the apostolic side, and so when they were in love and they wanted to get married, the mother of the father or something said, no way,
Mm.
you can't do that. She's from a totally different sect of Christianity and all that. So, but they were insistent, they wanted to get married. And then, so my great grandmother, great great grandmother, put a stipulation that was so outrageous. She thought she could dissuade them from getting married, but they still did it. She said, if you get married and you have a child, that child is going to be mine. You have to give up that child. That's the only
Wow.
way I'm going to let you guys go. It was
My
just, this is
goodness.
the story. Yeah, it was just very odd. And that's pretty much what happened. So when my grandmother was born, she was given to her grandmother to
Wow.
be raised as her mother and father, the grandmother and grandfather. And so her real mother and father were known to her as uncle and aunt,
Mm.
because they had three other girls, and those were either they were really her sisters,
Yeah.
but she grew up with them as cousins. Yeah. And uh, then when my great grandfather got killed, shot, again around the time of the genocide,
Mm.
the truth came out, and she was so livid,
Mm.
and she was, already like early teens maybe at that time, and uh, she said, "You denied me of a father, my true father, and this and that." So there was really a lot of hostility, kind of this, there. And when there was a chance for one of the sisters to go to U.S. to live with an uncle who
Mm.
was well-to-do, they actually came from a more well-to-do family. That grandmother's side. Um, she said, "No way, I'm going,
Mm.
because this is what you guys did to me, and basically I'm going to be going, and I want to get away from you guys as much as possible."
Wow.
So my grandmother went to the United States around the turn of the 19, I don't know, whenever it was,
Mm.
1914, 15, 16, some around that time period.
Yeah.
And she grew up in New York. She learned English. She already knew how to play the piano, so she taught piano at a local girls' school. And she befriended a lot of non-Armenians, a lot of immigrants like Irish and
Uh-huh.
Scottish and all that. And that's where I got my name from,
Oh.
because it was one of her best friends who was Scottish, was Hazel.
Uh-huh.
And so she used to, years later, she said, "Oh, Hazel did this for me. She was so kind, blah blah blah." So the name stuck with my mother too,
Mm.
who wanted to move to the U.S. eventually.
Mm.
And so she thought, so that's how that, because people say, "How come it's such an odd name for someone born in Armenia,"
Yeah.
you know. Anyway, so my grandmother stayed in the U.S. for many years until, um, while she was in the U.S., her mother and sisters and grandmother, so all the males had passed away,
Mm.
the grandfather and the great great grandfather. They moved to France, and so they lived in a place called Dessines, and it was on the suburbs of Lyon,
Mm.
and so southern France. Um, well, not like Marseille area, but a little bit north. And they grew up there. And when my great grandmother was sick, my grandmother's mother was sick and dying, um, my grandmother said, "Okay," she was, I guess, in her 30s at that time. She says, "I have to go back to France."
Mm.
And so, because all that time she just stayed away, for many years. And so she did. She came back to France in the 30s, and she was, of course, well dressed, U.S. kind of, air. And she, so her mother died. So she decided she'll just stay there now and help with the sisters who were younger. And the grandmother was the one that made that deal.
Yeah.
She was still alive.
Wow.
She lived till 90, in her 90s. And then eventually my grandmother met my grandfather in Paris
Mm.
because of some party that happened, and so they met and they got married, and so they lived in France. there was a lot of issues going on in France with Armenians, as far as being an
Okay.
and yeah, an immigrant. They didn't, they didn't look at them in a very now they look at them in a very revered way, but they didn't at that time. There was, the Saleh Armenian, the dirty Armenian, was a common thing they would say.
Wow.
And one day, my grandmother, this is a story she said, she went into a bakery and there was an old Armenian woman, and like, almost off the boat kind of look, and the French salesperson called her Salah Mignon, and it's when she was leaving, and my grandmother heard, and she knows French, she knows, um, and so she told her in French. She said, "Excuse me, but that was very disrespectful. You don't know the history of what Armenians have gone through, blah blah blah." And because she was well dressed, she was not. She didn't look like that to
Mm.
that lady. And at the very end of her little speech, because my grandmother's a teacher, and so she
Mm.
schooled her on this
Yeah.
issue. And so the lady said, "Oh, excusez-moi, madame," and apologized that I didn't know and this and that. So that was what was happening at that time. And then there was some internal issues about the house. When my great great grandmother died, the house in Dessin was now bequeathed to the three sisters, because I forgot to say one of the sisters had died from typhoid when
Mm.
she was young. So they were four, and then now they ended up to be three at
Okay.
that time period. And so the two sisters that were more or less raised in France, they needed the money. They wanted my grandmother to agree to sell the house. But my grandmother didn't want to sell the house because she's more nostalgic. And so she was pressured.
Mm.
And it was now, at this time, it was in the late 40s. Okay, so World War II happened. In fact, she had some stories where there were American soldiers in their town who needed help, and no one knew the language except my grandmother. She spoke English. So
Wow.
she helped them, and they gave her a flag and all that. So she really loved this. It's an American flag that they
Mm.
gave her. And so she kept that. And so then fast forward to 1947, there was a major propaganda going on with the Soviet Union and under Stalin,
Mm.
who was
Mm.
trying to get Armenians and Ukrainians and anybody coming back to the Soviet Union, because at World War II they lost a lot of people, and so they all the like AGBU was a major
Yeah.
pusher for this for Armenians to go back. So they painted a really rosy picture of what it would be like. You'll get free education, they'll give you a place to live, they'll find you jobs and this and that. So people were really uprooting themselves and
Mm.
selling their homes, quitting their jobs, pulling kids out of school, and getting on these ships with their cargo and going, you know,
Wow.
to Soviet Armenia. And so my grandmother, so both my sides of my family did that for different reasons, but they
Mm.
did. And so since I'm on the side with the grandmother in France, she said, "Well, I'm being pressured by my sisters to sell the house. Our work is not well. Our work is not going well because we're looked at second class citizens in France. They're not even naturalizing us because of, even though we're sending our kids to fight in the wars, we're paying our taxes, and we're doing all these things. We're not breaking any laws. They're still not, honoring us with certain things." So my grandmother said, "Let's just sell the house. We take our proceeds and we go to Armenia, and my sisters can have their proceeds, and so on and so forth." So, so that's what happened. But when there was a sticky point about France not now letting people go to Soviet
Oh.
Armenia, and so they faced a little bit of a problem with the government. So, and this is the part that's really kind of strange. So they got my mother, who was about 12, to be smuggled onto the ship to go to Soviet Army, and then they would join them later, because it's actually the children, because they're French born. My mother's born
Mm.
in France, my uncle is born in France. they didn't want the French-born children to go to to the Soviet Union.
Okay.
They didn't care about the parents who were not born there. But now you're breaking up families, so how are you going to do that? So they tried to get smuggled my mother, and I don't know why my uncle. I don't know, because he was a baby, I guess, at that point. I don't know. So he I guess stayed with my my grandmother and grandfather until they got on. But then the French found out there was some smuggled citizens, so they went and raided the ship, and everybody had to get off. And so my mother got off, and my mother at that point alerted my grandma and said, "You don't know what's going to be waiting for us, because I saw what they were trying to feed us on that ship. I saw the conditions. I heard people talk, and at that point it was too late. They sold everything.
Yeah.
They had nothing." And so my grandmother says, "Oh no, we can't, let's not do this." But my grandfather said, "Listen, everything is now, set in motion. We can't go back." So ultimately they all got back on the ship. The government acquiesced to the political diplomatic pressures. They let everybody go, including the French-born, and then they went to Armenia. But what they did is the ship goes from Marseille all the way to Batumi, and then at that point they disembark. I guess that word, and then they put them on a train from there and to Yerevan. And the train, if you want to look at it as being a train, is like what you would ship cattle.
Wow.
Okay, no chairs, no seating, cramped in, and that's how they. And when they got to Batumi, though, everybody knew that this was a disaster, because at that point, before they could get off the ship, the officials said you have to throw away all your food, because we don't want any contamination brought in. And so people were like in shock. So they did. They threw their food off, and then they saw locals, Georgian locals, swimming into the water taking food, because they were starving basically. And that's when it's like, oh my God, what are we doing here? And it's the same story that I heard when I was going after this family history, from the people from the US going in, from the people from France going in, anybody who went from other countries, from other diasporan countries going back. That's a similar story that they all told me. And it was pretty shocking to hear that. So anyway, that side of my family ended up in actually both sides of my family ended up in Armenia in 1947 and 49. There were two caravans, and so when I finally started to well, let me back up and say that when I was looking at photo albums when I was a kid, I could never understand these photographs. So like this one, where is my mother and father? I don't get it. Or me growing up with my sister, I mean, where are we walking? I didn't understand, and no one spoke about it. And I didn't have the wherewithal to ask when I was young. But it was always a curiosity. It was a given. Okay, this is where I am. But then later on, I started questioning, and I was already in my 40s, and I had my kids, so I kind of wanted to pass it like that history. So I started asking. My father wouldn't talk about it. My mother would, and then my grandparents already passed away, so I didn't have a chance to talk to them about it, which would have been great, because they were the ones who made that decision. So I only got the second generation information from the second generation. So then I put in a little article in the Haisharjum in here, and I said at the end, I said, if you are a repatriate, because that's what they call them, Nerkacht, if your history deals with this history, please contact me. I would love to interview you. And I got some trickles from LA area, and one woman wrote to me. She said, your story is exactly my story, except my mother was from Marseille and my father was from Egypt. And then another one says, your story is exactly like my story, but my mother was from Lebanon and my father was from, whatever.
Wow.
And so I thought, okay, this is an untapped history because I was doing this in 2010, 2011.
Mm.
And I thought, okay, this is interesting because at that point also I was, an artist. I'm painting. I've been really painting all my life, but got into a gallery in my 40s. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to do an exposition. So it's going to be kind of an art and ethnographic
Mm-hmm.
response to this history. And so then I started going into some archives, and a lot of things hadn't been archived. So I was talking to people at NASA, and they said, there might be boxes of information in someone's attic or basement, and we just don't know about it because no one has, no one has brought it in for us to archive it. So I was looking at newspaper articles from that period and tried to get as much as I could,
Mm.
but mostly from interviews and whatever they had. And I thought, okay, I have family photographs. They must have family photographs. And that's what I did. I traveled around with my clunky scanner
Wow.
at that time because it wasn't that as sophisticated. I brought, I took my camera, my tripod, everything. It was like a big load. And I went to France with it. I went and interviewed people. I went across the U.S., mainly in East Coast and Southern California, and I scanned some amazing photos from these people's albums. It was incredible because this is the stuff that, no, it's not in a box in the basement, but it's still in somebody's house that no one's that they haven't shared. And the social history is so wonderful from these photographs, as long as they can still explain it. Or so I saw where, and the couple of them that pop up, I saw where in Soviet Armenia they would hold weddings and baptisms in the house with the priest wearing only their garment in the house, because on the streets you could not wear your 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 church garment. And uh, then I saw how there was these little parties of different kind of repatriates who would get together because they couldn't really assimilate with the local Armenians. So the French Armenians and the American Armenians and Lebanese Armenians, they had more of a commonality than with Eastern Armenians. And the Eastern Armenians looked at them like they were totally foreigners, even though they're Armenians. And they would also discriminate against them, throw rocks at them sometimes when they see them riding a bike because they've never seen something like that. So it was, you hear those stories. Uh, the clothing, that was a big thing because here they're westernized, they're wearing the latest and greatest type of thing, and then these people look like from Russian serfdom, kind of clothing. And so there was that divide, and many other things that they told me. I saw a photograph of um, the father and mother of one girl I was interviewing in a museum that was all Stalin. So it was the Stalin Museum, and all it was his picture, his bust, his this, his that. That's it. And I thought, oh my God, this is great. It was located at the base of the Lenin's sculpture or Stalin sculpture. I don't know. So you could get in. It was like a little museum, and of course it's gone now. But I have the photograph of it, and I thought this is fantastic. And then a lot of photographs of them on the ships coming in with these great smiles because they're thinking that everything's going to be wonderful. And then, of course, then they get here and it's a total disaster. So that's kind of how I learned that history. Otherwise, if I didn't probe into it, I could not be sitting here telling you any of this. Yeah.
That's great. I was wondering, could you tell me if you know about the family members on your dad's side, them coming back to Armenia?
Okay, so in essence, it's the same.
Mhm.
It's the same story for both. In 1953, Stalin dies, and a lot of things get more relaxed. Some of the Americans were looked at as spies. Some of my father's friends were sent to hard labor camps, or their parents were sent because they were looked at as American spies. They had cameras, but
Mm.
it was for recreational purposes, but they didn't know that. Then if you're U.S. born or foreign born, and in Armenia, they just they either wanted your goods, so they would purposely make it so they sent you to the gulag or something so that they can get your stuff, your furniture, your refrigerator, because it's all Western brought. They brought
Mm.
everything with them, and um, and people disappeared sometimes in the middle of the night, and that was that big
Wow.
X on your door kind of thing. When you saw that, you knew that family had been deported. And there was a French pharmacist family that was friends of my grandmother, and she she was walking to their house one day, and she saw that, and she knew exactly what happened, and she got very nervous and concerned. So when she went back home, remember that American flag?
Mm-hmm.
She burned it.
Mm.
She didn't want to have that connection to America or any West suspicion around her family. So sadly, that's some of the things that would happen. So when Stalin died in '53, things got a little bit more relaxed. Some of those people were released, considered political prisoners or
Mm.
dissidents. They were released, they came back, but of course their families were shattered. And we were one of the earlier people who got out of the Soviet Union. So in 1956, the French Prime Minister visited Armenia.
Mm.
His name was Christian. No, I think.
I think
Do you know the name?
that sounds familiar.
Yeah, and there was in Paris Match, a big article, and I was able to find the actual journal. Um, I they He came to Armenia because the Russians were the Soviet Armenians, Russians were touting, oh, our French Armenians, they just love it here. They're relaxed. They are enjoying life here. You need to come and see them, blah, blah, blah. Little did they know that when the French Armenians were there, they didn't just say, oh, hi, we're happy, blah, blah. They actually broke through the barricades.
Wow.
And tried to reach him. And there was this pictures, and the press was with them.
Uh-huh.
And so the French press, and so they captured all these pictures of the French Armenians who were saying, "Here, take my child. I don't want him growing up here. Please get us out of here." All that kind of thing. So it was captured on film. There's a lot of pressure. The Russians or the Soviet Armenians officials were thrown off guard, and so then they have to kind of diplomatically figure out what's happening. So some of the French Armenians also were one of the early ones to leave. They had to figure out a way to appease, a world pressure. And so they left. We were some of the early Americans that were able to leave with constant writing to Eisenhower. President Eisenhower was the president at that time. So there was an interesting letter that I dug out of out of his archives, that basically was, and they weren't naming themselves, but we American Armenians stuck in,
Yeah.
Soviet Union, please, we made a mistake, or our parents made a mistake, and we need to get out, type of thing. So all that was happening in the late 50s,
Mm.
and because of, so I had two sides that needed to show direct relatives. They said, okay, we'll let you out if you have a direct relative, a mother, a father, sister, or brother. On the outside, they can petition and take you out. That's it. Not cousins, not distant relatives. It had to be primary. And so my grandmother, that was from the orphanage in Syria, who had that switch of the birth certificate, showed a sister in the U.S.
Wow.
And that's how my father's side got out.
Uh-huh.
Then my grandmother on my mother's side showed her sister in Paris. So that's how, because they didn't go,
Okay.
and so that's how they got out. And then so we left in 1965.
Wow.
Yeah, and my father, who is a who loves to save everything, to the detriment of my mother. She just said she just saves too much, but yet he found the old Pan Am airline ticket of
Mm,
when we left,
wow.
and I said, "Oh my God, I love that." So I got that. I used it in some of my work,
Oh, great.
and uh, it's not an airline around anymore,
Mm,
and just to see the seat numbers and names and how much it cost, it was pretty interesting. So
that's fascinating.
yeah,
And so you were born in Armenia.
yes,
Can you tell me, or you're very young at this point, do
uh-huh.
you have any memories of what life was like for
Yeah,
you?
it's a good question because I don't.
Okay.
And the only time I remember is when I have flash memory, is if I looked at a photograph, and I'm not sure if that's even a memory because I'm
Uh-huh.
looking at a photograph. The other the only thing I can say, and again I don't know if it's from photographs, and then a feeling of some presence, is when I went back to Armenia in 2000. I think it was 2003, 4, 8. I don't know when it was.
Mhm.
Um, I I took my oldest son at that time, I think, and I'm walking around, and certain things would hit me emotionally,
Mm.
and I just break down and cry because, and I don't know whether I'm feeling that that feeling of I've been there, or it's the photograph that's,
Mm.
you know, bringing that on, and all of a sudden I'm welling because I'm in that space. So I can't say, oh yes, I remember blah blah blah. It's hard. Yeah, and I don't know what it's from. I've always speculated that it's because I lost my ability to speak my language, because Armenian was my first language. I was
Mm,
speaking it
wow.
until I was 5. Then when I had to come to the U.S. and start kindergarten, I had no English background
Mhm.
and popped into kindergarten, uh, bawling because I don't understand anybody, and my mother, I wouldn't let my mother go. She had to stay in the, I had
Wow.
to keep looking around to make sure she was still there. And
Oh.
my father, who knew English, and my other grandmother knew English. They were only ones who knew English,
Mm.
that side. My father's side, and then the sole person on my mother's side. So eventually we had to just do flip. No more Armenian, not in the house, no, not anywhere. English,
Oh.
everything English, so that we could assimilate, because that was the big thing: assimilate, get along, um, almost forget your culture, and that's basically what happened. So I totally lost my ability to speak Armenian, but everything was in here, and it just couldn't come out.
Mm.
So I could understand when my parents were saying something, and they would, they act like they're saying secrets, and I said, I do understand. I still
Uh-huh.
understand the language. I know what you're saying, but I couldn't say it in Armenian. And so when I had my kids, I thought, okay, I want to speak to them in Armenian at least the first year.
Mm.
So my oldest was born, and I said, I'm going to go straight, even though my husband was non-Armenian, and he was okay with that. I just spoke straight Armenian to him, and I couldn't, because it's still simple sentences, when a kid is born, and it was enough Armenian that I could do it. I'm not having, like, any kind of a political discussion.
Mhm.
So I did, and I said, even if he never speaks the language, I knew enough about that language that had all these wonderful sounds, and I knew enough that the brain can make those connections, the
That's
neural
great.
connections with the sounds. And so I said, I want them to at least have that. Then of course my oldest son had problems again because of knowing English on one side, Armenian, and so his language was gobbled.
Mm.
So then at 2 years old, I went to English so that he wouldn't struggle with kids in the neighborhood. And I did the same with my second son. And then they did go to Armenian school. So I
Uh-huh.
put them in Armenian school, and they learned to read and write. So at least they had something, and if they later on in life they go back, they had some foundation set as a kid. And I think that's what helped me too, because later in life I went and I took Armenian language at Fresno State,
Oh, great.
and it all came back. Then I also had when my oldest was still a baby, a lady from Armenia came who was a good family friend, and she wanted to stay in America for a bit. And she said, "Oh, I can help you, like help you with the kid and all that." And I said, "Okay, sure." And she didn't know any English, so I had to speak Armenian with her, and that was wonderful because I was I was forced to learn the words and sentences. But she spoke Eastern Armenian and I spoke Western.
Oh.
So it was still okay, but I kind of learned a little bit of both.
Uh-huh.
It's not a it's an impure, my Armenian is very impure, and also because my family had thrown in French words, Turkish words, what they learned, and Russian words.
Wow.
So it was yeah, that's basically where it is. But someday it's my bucket list. It's on my bucket list to learn really a fluent reading and writing and the language.
Wow.
Yeah, because it's really beautiful, I think, and especially when I listen to medieval Armenian, like the grapar, and I listen to the poetry, like Saint Mrs. Shinohali, and it's just so beautiful, especially with the rhyming that they do with certain sounds. And I always wonder, how do you even translate that to English? You really can't. You have to really know and learn it in that language. So,
Mm, that is
uh,
beautiful. Would you mind sharing a bit about your early years in America and what your family was like?
yeah. So back to kind of this assimilation,
Hmm.
we uh, we had to just uh, kind of divorce ourselves from where we came from so we can fit in, because we're still kind of looked at as foreigners, and people didn't know who an Armenian was in the 60s and the 70s. I had friends say, "What is that, a religion?" They didn't know what that was. And uh, I did befriend a lot of these minorities because I felt like them.
Mm.
I had a lot of friends from uh, different different cultures, and I loved that cosmopolitan feel of having friends from all over different parts of the world. My father went to grad school in Madison, Wisconsin, and that was also a hub for a lot of graduate students from around the world. So I had friends from India, I had friends from um, the Middle East, from I had friends from southern part of the U.S. like
Mhm.
Alabama, and I had African American friends, and then I saw the hostility between some of my friends because I didn't know the politics of late 60s U.S. So that was happening, and um, Vietnam War was being just televised on TV. We were seeing that, so it was a turmoilish time. So I never really truly felt American, but I never felt also European, which my mother's side, and I didn't feel Armenian. So I felt kind of a lost in
Oh.
a certain way as far as identity. And I had to come to terms with it later in life.
Mm.
And there was some times where I would deny my Armenian identity just to fit in because of that. It wasn't a moment to be, oh, I'm proud because I'm this. It was a moment almost sometimes to just blend in so you don't stick out,
Hmm.
that kind of thing, which is sad, yeah. But that's what it was when I was growing up,
Yeah.
and then I also I threw myself into my art because I was a kid that drew,
Uh-huh.
and I isolated myself from all that external noise by just drawing um, and creating. I even did little plays. And my sister, which I hope someday you'll meet. she was like the actress, and we would put little fairy tales with the little kids around
Mm-hmm.
the block. So uh, I did I did writing, you know, kids writing, of course, but that's the arts were my my escape.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's great.
or healing
Uh-huh.
process. And my family, like I said, didn't talk about anything of the country, so
Mm.
that's why I didn't. There was that detachment because they didn't speak about it. It was the
Mm-hmm.
struggle of surviving now in the U.S., finding work paying the bills, um, and getting the education and so on and so forth.
Can you tell me how your sense of Armenian identity changed over time and if there were specific
Yeah,
moments that initiated that?
I think the birth of my kids did
Mm.
because I didn't want them to not have that, which uh, and I'm trying to think if there's any time before. No, I think I was just growing up like a kid that you know you know almost was born here, uh, because I didn't have an accent.
Mm.
I mean, people think now I do have some kind of accent, but I thought I know I didn't speak like the true American slang stuff, but I didn't have this heavy foreign accent, so I felt like I blended in somehow. My name was not Armenian, except for one grandmother did. My father's mother never called me Hazel. She called me by an Armenian name.
Oh.
Yeah, that she had given me and my sister, and but other than that, I felt like ingrained in the American fabric. And I think it was because it wasn't junior high, wasn't high school, wasn't college. I think it was. Again, I never truly felt like I belonged anywhere. That feeling was always hanging with me. And then I think when um, my kids, were, my first child was born, that's when I said, no, I need to connect back
Wow,
with my roots. Yeah.
that's great. Can you share more about your experience in college and your career as well?
Oh, okay. So yeah, I basically loved science and I loved art, and I was like that in high school, and so I didn't know what I wanted to do because they seemed two different tracks.
Mm.
But I was always drawing with my mom, who was a tailor, she was trained as a uh, tailor in the Soviet Army,
Mm.
and so she made these wonderful suits and dresses, and I would draw clothing on paper dolls, and I was doing all that, and I would love to sew, and so they said, oh well, why don't you try fashion school? I said, and I was like 18, 17. I was
Wow.
just graduating. I said, well, okay. I didn't know what else to do. So they sent me to LA. I went to FIDM, and I basically graduated as a fashion designer, but I really got into illustration because
Mm.
that's where I went. And at that time, it was the 80s, and fashion illustration was still done by hand,
Wow.
no computers, things
Mm-hmm.
like that. And so that's what I did for a year. But I still missed not having a degree. So I thought, okay, let me go check out UCLA for art degree.
Wow.
And so I went there for 2 semesters. It struggled, but I got grants because I did very well. I was an A student, so I got some grants, and uh, I took one anthropology class, and I thought, oh my God, I love my science. Why am I doing? And at that time, they were teaching studio art, which is postmodern art,
Uh-huh.
and it was not the traditional classical way of teaching painting and drawing.
Oh.
They were total. It was all conceptual art, and so I wasn't connecting with it. So I thought, okay, I'll just leave the art. I'll switch majors,
Mm.
and at that point, a lot of personal things were happening as well with relationships. So I thought, okay, I'm going to leave LA. I come to Fresno, continue my science here,
Wow.
and
At
so
Fresno State?
uh-huh.
Okay.
And so then, so got into becoming a chemistry major, and then I got married, and so I had to go back to LA and finished my chemistry degree there.
Mm.
And I finished the degree there. I worked in the weirdest things. I worked at the LA County morgue thinking that I wanted to get into forensics chemistry. And I said, after 3 months, I said, no way. Then I got into environmental science, and that's where I worked for many years with the air quality district. And then I got my master's in environmental policy. And after that point, when Adam was born, all of a sudden something again. It's like that click of this switching of the Armenianness came into play, and the arts came back, and I went back into painting.
Wow.
And then I kind of just stuck there, yeah, with the arts. And then I just finished and I got my doctorate in philosophy, aesthetics, and art theory. So I'm really excited about that. Yeah. So see what that's going to go.
So you mentioned getting back into art and also these travels and interviews you were able to do to collect people's stories of repatriation. Can you tell me what those experiences meant for you?
Oh yeah, so it was in 2010 that I was going through my own personal kind of changes of like, again, who am I? What am I doing? I did start the Armenianness with my kids, but I still didn't fulfill it for me. And I think at that point is when, and also the job, I had just graduated with a master's in art history, and there was nothing going on job market wise. I talked to a colleague of mine now, and I said, I'd love to be teaching. Is there any teaching at the community college? She says, now we're not hiring anything, but I will keep you posted. I said, okay, that's great. So then I'm kind of like, not doing much. I did volunteer at the museum. I did work at the museum for a bit, and I worked on the Arshil Gorky exhibition and the Saroyan Centennial. But again, it was not enough, It was, and so I said, well, since I have this free time, let me go into this project that was on this back burner of who I am from this history, and put it on the front burner now and start actively working on it. And let me do an artist's response to this history. And that's when I started saying, oh, okay, I got to start collecting photographs beyond my own album, my family's album. I have to start talking to people, interviewing people. And so it snowballed, and it was effortless. So that means that was the way to go, because the door was kept opening, nothing was closing, and it widened and widened, where I would have people contact me from Canada, from I talked to somebody from there, I talked to people in France, in Armenia, in Greece, and it was naturally kind of progressing. So I was really happy about that. And then I said, okay, how do I present this as I go along? I don't want to just hoard this information and then not know what I'm doing with it. So I thought, okay, I'll bring the photographs together, bring the stories together, do a multimedia presentation, and read the stories, show the imagery with music of the times, and so on and so forth. And that's what I did. And I did it in LA. It started in Fresno at the museum, and then I went to LA, then in New York, and then I went to London, Oxford, and I said, I've got to show it in Paris. And it never happened. I was trying, because a lot of the people I interviewed were from Paris. And then never happened. But then in 2016, I did a big exhibition in Yerevan, so that was good, because that was also a goal of mine. And then in 2021, some of what I had done, but in a different mode, was presented finally in Paris, because in 2020 I was going to present there and be there, but COVID hit and they postponed it. In 2021 I couldn't really travel much still, but we were able to, with digital transfer of imagery, they were able to do something at it was at Nalco, which is where it's one of the universities where we showed some work. And so that was great. I was able to do that, and it was fulfilling, because I learned about myself, and I also shared what others had gone through and could not necessarily, or did not necessarily, want to share it that way. They were open to me, but they're not like artists who are gonna, you know, haul this project the way I did. So I was happy about that. Um, what was the other? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, just
Okay.
your engagement in art. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's fascinating. Did you have any other projects or inspirations after these?
So yeah, so once that finished, and I truly felt it wasn't completely finished because I wanted to put it into a book form, the stories. And so I started writing it as stories, and then I said, no, that's not working. Then I started writing it as letters. In fact, the Paris show was called Imaginary Letters to Vasily Grossman. And why I did that was Vasily Grossman was a Russian, Jewish Russian writer who ended up in Yerevan to do some translation. And he did a book called a sketchbook of Armenia, or a sketchbook. And it published around the time I was doing my presentations. It published in English. And so at the tail end of my shows, I saw this and I thought, oh, this is interesting because he's coming into Yerevan in the 60s and we're leaving. And so I thought I could do these imaginary letters to him about what he's seeing, and what I saw is almost similar, and that sort of thing. So I did that for an art exhibition, and I thought I could do that in a publication, but you know, I started doing my doctoral, so everything got pushed, you know, when I'm doing my work. So I'm still not sure how I'm framing these stories. Do I make them poetry? So then I thought, okay, let me take a couple of poetry classes and see if I can put it into a not necessarily prose, or maybe prose poetry. I think it might end up like that.
Wow.
The other person, someone was suggesting doing journalistic poetry. So I might even do it that way. So that's where I am. I'm working on that.
That's fascinating.
And what I'm also currently fabricating with Varajan and a art show coming up is a connection with that, this whole thing that I did, but showing it visually in painting form. Um, the How do I say it? Uh, the land, the memory that's etched into the landscape. So I haven't really formulated that quite yet, so I can't unfortunately articulate it. But I'm trying to come up with a, a way, and I said that's why I was attracted to your project, because I thought, okay, you guys have that map of where everybody ends up, and that's kind of what I wanted to do, because that's a landscape, that's this mapping, that's this global thing, but I wanted to do it in painting, and I wanted to be interactive. So I am not only just the artist responding, I want my viewers, my spectators, to be creating the work with me, not necessarily looking at it, but being involved in the art making. So that's where I am.
Wow, that's great.
So when I'm finished, I'll let you know.
Oh no, I would love to see that. I'm curious if you could tell me what it's been like being Armenian in Fresno, and if your engagements with the community have been different at all.
Yeah, for sure. In the 70s, we were here, and because we had a big Armenian population, I didn't feel as lost. And also, we went to a lot of the Armenian events here, picnics, and I was involved with the Hofman basketball with for the girls for a while. We went to church and did the Sunday school, and so I had that connection. I didn't have many friends from that, but I knew I had acquaintances. I had some close friends that were Armenian in high school, and that was about it. So yeah, it was a more comfortable feeling again, but I didn't speak the language, and then when I did go to my first semester at Fresno State, or second semester, I did take some Armenian classes with Dr. Kayunjan at that time, and so that felt good too because there was mostly Armenians there. And then when I did my master's many years later, I actually my thesis was on an Armenian manuscript. So that allowed me to really delve into medieval Armenian history, which I absolutely love.
Wow.
And so there was a connection there too. And I think that also brought out, of course, my kids were already born, and so that was the continuation of this learning the Armenian, having them in Armenian school because that was here in Fresno, and I loved that connection, especially with my oldest son. When we moved from LA, because he was born in LA, to Fresno, he was 3. I had to put him into daycare because I found a job working at the Air District here just for a short period of time, and it was with the Lutheran church here because my husband was Lutheran, and so we thought we'd try that at the daycare, and he just didn't get along with anybody. It was just too foreign. They called me. They said, "Get your kid out of here." He just crying all the time, and so I felt so bad, and I didn't know what to do. And then so for a short interim, because he was only 3 and the Armenian school wasn't taking any kids until they were 4.
Oh.
And so I said, well, what do I do? And so we found an Armenian nanny who had 2 little daughters, and she was at home. She was staying at home with her little girls, so she helped the small transition time period until he turned 4. And then once he got into Armenian school, he felt like he was at home. And I loved that. That was very important to me. And they didn't have that many kids. The kids were, they're all Armenian. They were speaking Armenian. They understood it, even though maybe they weren't speaking it, but they were learning it. So it felt like an extended family.
Wow. And were all of your kids able to go to that Armenian school?
Yeah, so on and off. The Armenian school started from kindergarten to 6th grade. Yeah, 6th grade. Then they finally created a nursery program, and that's why my youngest son was able to get into it a little earlier. The funny part of this school system is that I don't necessarily, live in the best school area district, so that's why the Armenian school was great. But at 5th grade, I had to decide because there's no junior high, and the junior high is only 2 grades here. So I had to decide: do I pull him out at 5th grade, try to get him into a school that has 5, 6, 7, and 8, and then he goes to high school. So it was all these complications. So they went only slivers of the grade levels, and then they also went to the U.S. schools.
Yeah. Wow. And
or public school, I should say. Yeah.
I know language was a big part of preserving Armenian culture for you, but I was wondering if you could speak to any other ways you've been able to bring Armenian culture into your family.
Right. So for sure, the food and getting together with the grandparents.
Oh, wow.
That was important. Holidays and different occasions, birthdays. Yeah, I guess, that way. Taking them to Armenia. So I took both of them to Armenia. One was around 12 and the other one 10. Even though my dad, I remember saying, oh, what are they going to get out of it? They're not going to remember anything. I said, you know what? They'll get something. They'll get the connection. They'll get a feel. They'll get maybe a little bit of language learning. They'll get maybe just seeing the scenery, whatever it is, it's going to be part of them. And so I'm very happy that I did. So both of them have at least been there as a kid. Wow. And I think Andre, my youngest, went twice with me because we went to France. Maybe we went to Armenia from there. I don't remember. But yeah, so I'm very much into seeing the world, and having them experience, not living just in one city and, not venturing out. So I'm, if you I say if we have the money, even if we don't, we pay we pay our charge card off. It's important to do that. Yeah. So.
That's great. Can you share any hopes you have for the future of the Armenian community?
Community here in Fresno,
in
or
Fresno
just
or in
yeah. I would like, the hope is I would like more, and it was something actually that was said at a board meeting we just had at the museum, that they were reminiscing about the Armenian picnics that they used to have here, and so one of the artists one of the artists is going to show his photography of a certain time period of all these picnics that he took, and we're going to have that as a display. And I thought, gosh, why don't we still have that? Except for the Great Blessing, we don't do much of anything else as a community, and we're not that big, and everybody's kind of living their own little lives. But it'd be nice. Sometimes the churches hold little bazaars and things, but it's not the same. It's more of fundraising, but we don't want to do it as fundraising all the time. We want to do it as community engagement, and that would be nice. More support for the museum and what it's doing. That would be nice to see the Armenian community doing that. There are some that are very engaged. There are some that are so hands off that, it's sad because they've lost the connection. There's Armenian families that you couldn't even say they're Armenian anymore. They've just all kind of, they've become that thing that I didn't want, that assimilated, dissolved. It's nice to be able to be chameleon in a way, You can be, when you're with Americans, you're with them, but when you're with Armenians, you're also with them. And so I think that's important. So those are the hopes.
Yeah,
and the hope is for the Armenian Museum to flourish and to engage, all sectors of life, and that's what we're trying to do.
I guess I was wondering, since you do have a very international scope, I guess, if that hope or idea differs for all the other countries you visited, or Yerevan as well.
Oh, well, when I go there, I feel included, because I think now there's a westernized the feel there, and they do love, the Armenians from the diaspora, but then there's still people that are resentful. So I don't interact with them, but the ones that I do interact with, they're very lovely people. And what I love over there, and was when I was a couple of times when I was there during the Golden Apricot Film Festival. And if you've never done that, you have to go.
Okay.
In July, a certain time in July, it's fabulous. So they hold, it's like their own little country's film festival, and they bring in films from all over the world that enter, and they'll have the openings, and they'll have some VIPs. Really, I saw Jacqueline Bisset there one time. Yeah, it was really wonderful. And so you get to for very little money, you get to see all these wonderful films that have been entered, and you're running around different theaters, and you're bumping into people who are going, what show did you see, and all that. It's really wonderful. And then they have little theaters of locals there that are fabulous. There's very culturally oriented country, I think.
Yeah.
You can go to the park and see people selling their paintings. They have museums, more museums, I think, per square footage there than anywhere. It's just, even if it's a home museum of an artist or a musician, they're just, they appreciate their culture, their arts and culture there, and that's what I love. So yeah, I know that will keep going, because they enjoy living, they enjoy the kef, they enjoy drinking and eating and having that cafe kind of feel. In fact, there was one cafe that it was not too far from where I was staying, and they were playing Charles Aznavour music, and and you're having your very French feel of coffee and crepe and all that. So
wow.
yeah, so and in fact, it was funny because I went into a boulangerie and I thought, like, kind of like our boulangeries, and I said to myself, I'm going to practice some French, and literally they spoke back in French to me. I could say it, and a lot of the young kids, they can speak, English, Armenian, Russian, French, and sometimes Spanish, Italian. I mean, it's amazing.
Oh my goodness.
So that's why tourists, I think, can feel very comfortable there. So that's what's
great.
Wonderful.
And I was wondering if you could share, what does being Armenian mean to you?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I think I'm grateful that I've had the opportunity and the people around me to come back to this Armenianness and explore and feel that, and that I wasn't placed in situations where I had to deny it. So, and I'm still exploring. Like I say, I love medieval Armenian history, so I want to go back and study it now from a different perspective, because, well, before it was more art historical, but now I want to look into the poetry, and I want to be able to read. So my goals are to be able to read Rapar, and I don't and maybe have conversations in Western, Eastern in a more fluent way, but read the old and read the current, the contemporary. Not necessarily right. I don't need to. That's not one of. That's my third. It would be drop down goal at the end of the list, but the reading and the speaking better.